Hello and welcome to the Interchange Book 3, Unit 15 video for tag questions. So today in this video we're going to talk about different types of questions that we call tag questions. So to start, let's look at this situation. Here we have two old classmates. We have Manuel and Janet. So Manuel is walking in the street, or he's at the supermarket, and he sees Janet. And he remembers Janet from a class they had together a few years ago. So he stops and he talks to her. So let's listen to the conversation they have as old classmates. Oh, hi. I remember you from class. Your name is Janet, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And you're Manuel, aren't you?
Yeah, I am. And you were in my English class, weren't you?
Yeah, I was. We had class together 2 years ago, didn't we?
Yeah, we did. That was a long time ago, wasn't it?
I know, but it doesn't feel like that long, does it?
I know, right? Hey, we should practice our English together sometime, shouldn't we?
That would be great. We haven't practiced in a long time, have we?
Sounds great. You still have the same phone number, don't you?
Yes, I do. Call me soon. Talk to you later.
So, in that conversation, we heard many different varieties of different types of tag questions. So let's take an example from that conversation and let's try to identify exactly what are the tag questions in the sentences. So to do this, let's first examine what is a tag question. Well, normally a tag question begins with some sort of affirmation, either negative or positive. But what makes the tag question, what makes this a question, is at the end of our sentence, at the end of our affirmation, we have an auxiliary verb and a subject. And that essentially is what makes our tag question, is the auxiliary and the subject. So let's look at this first sentence. It says, oh, hi, I remember you from English class. Your name is Janet, isn't it? So what's the tag question? Yes, so our tag is, isn't it? The auxiliary and the subject. And in the second example, it says, yeah, it is. And you are Manuel, aren't you? So again, the tag in this particular sentence is, aren't you? So let's take a look at the grammar for tag questions. Let's take this example and let's analyze it. So it reads, your name is Janet, isn't it? So I need to identify first, what is my subject in this first part of the sentence? This is the affirmation, right? So the subject in this case is your name. Your name. Now, your name in this context is my subject, and I'm thinking about using that in my tag question. I'm going to use the subject pronoun it. If we look and we try to remember what are subject pronouns are things like this: I, you, he, she, it, they, and we. So in the context of your name is it. It is a thing. So I'm going to use the subject pronoun in my tag question, it. Now let's look at my verb, my auxiliary verb. My auxiliary verb in the sentence is the verb is. So to make this into a tag question, I use the opposite form of the auxiliary verb in the tag question. So I need to use the same subject pronoun, but I use the opposite form of the auxiliary in the tag question. So this reads, your name is Janet, isn't it? And isn't it is my tag question. So let's take a look at a second example. Here we have the sentence, we haven't practiced in a long time, have we? Now in this example, I'm using we as my subject, and I'm going to repeat that in my tag using the same subject pronoun. And in this context, my auxiliary verb is haven't, right? It's not the main verb. It's the auxiliary verb that I need to use in my auxiliary. Now, here in my first part of the affirmation, it's a negative, haven't. So I need to use the opposite of that. I use the opposite form of the auxiliary to make the tag question. So my tag question is, have we? So we haven't practiced in a long time, have we? To make my tag. Okay, so let's practice by trying to think of what is the tag question for each one of these affirmations. So remember, without a tag, this sentence is just a normal affirmation. It's not a question. But with our tag, we make it a question. So let's look at this. First, number 1. And you are Manuel. The tag is, aren't you? Right? So here we have our subject, you, and our tag, are, becomes, aren't you? Okay? Number 2, you were in my English class. Weren't you? Again, I'm using my same subject, you and you, but I'm using the opposite of my auxiliary were in the tag, using weren't in the tag. Good. Number 3, that was a long time ago, wasn't it? So in this context, that is a thing, so I'm using it in my tag. And for my auxiliary was, I'm using the opposite, wasn't, in my tag. Number 4, it doesn't feel like that long, does it? So in this context, again, using the same subject, it. Now my auxiliary is doesn't, and I use the opposite in my tag, does. Number 5, we should practice our English, shouldn't we? So again, using the same subject, we and we, but using my opposite auxiliary, should, and using shouldn't in the tag. Okay, number 6, you still have the same phone number, don't you? Okay, so this one's a little bit confusing. And number 7 might be confusing too. Let's read number 7. We had class together 2 years ago. Didn't we? So for those of you who are confused on why 6 and 7 are using things like don't and didn't, let's take a closer look at these together. Okay, so here's something to think about. When no auxiliary verb is used in the affirmation, or in the first part of the sentence, use the opposite form of the main verb. So let's take a look at this first sentence. It says, you still have the same phone number. So if I think, what's my main verb? Well, my main verb is have, right? That's my main verb. Well, what's the opposite of have? Well, the opposite of have, technically, is don't have. And now I can see that I have an auxiliary. I have don't have. So in this context, when I don't see the auxiliary, I have to think the opposite. And usually with the opposite, I will then see what the auxiliary verb is, and I will know what type of auxiliary to use. So the tag question is, you still have the same phone number, don't you? And I'm using don't as the auxiliary. Okay, let's take a look at the second one. The second question reads, we had class together 2 years ago. Okay, again, let's look at the main verb. The main verb is had, and I need to think, well, what's the opposite of had? Well, the opposite of had is didn't have, the negative past, right? It's the negative past. So in this context, I'm going to use didn't as my auxiliary, right? And I'm going to say for the tag, we had class together 2 years ago. Didn't we? So again, when you don't see an auxiliary, you need to think, well, what's the main verb and what's the opposite of the main verb? And that's the auxiliary that you need to use. So in this context, don't and didn't. Okay, so now we know how to make a tag question, but now we need to look at why do we use tag questions? Well, one reason that we use tag question is to check for being correct. So remember Manuel, he sees Janet and he's thinking to himself, he says, well, I think her name is Janet, but I'm not sure. I'm not absolutely positive. So he wants to check to make sure that he is correct. And he's going to use his tag question, right? He's going to say, your name is Janet, isn't it? And notice when I'm checking to be correct for something, I have a very distinct upwards accent to make it a true question. So it reads like this, your name is Janet, isn't it? And that's the question, that's the tag, that rising inflection, right? This rising inflection makes it a question that asks about, am I correct? Okay? However, we have a second reason for why we use tag questions. The second reason we use tag questions are to check for another person's opinion about something. So in this way, this type of a tag question is not a real question because it's more of a question about the other person's opinion. You want to check for the other person's opinion. So Janet is thinking to herself, she says, well, I think that we should practice English together. And she says, I wonder if he thinks the same thing. So she has an opinion, and her opinion is that they should practice English together. But she wants to know what his opinion is. In this context, she's going to use a tag question. And she's going to say, we should practice together sometime. Shouldn't we? Okay? Now, notice for this type of a question, the accent on the tag is very neutral. There is no up accent or down accent. It's just said almost exactly the same as the affirmation. So again, it sounds like this. We should practice together sometime, shouldn't we? Right? Notice I'm not saying, shouldn't we? Because I'm not asking a question. I'm not checking to be correct. In this context, the person is just looking for the other person's opinion. So, just to review, the two reasons why we make tag questions and use tag questions are, number one, to check for being correct. So when Manuel isn't sure about Janet's name, he says, your name is Janet, isn't it? With the rising intonation to check for being correct. And the other reason we use tag questions is to check for another person's opinion about something. So when Janet said, we should practice together sometime, shouldn't we? And in this context, there is no rising intonation when you want to ask for someone else's opinion. So these are the two reasons why we make tag questions, and I hope this was helpful in learning how to make tag questions and why we use them. Good luck.